Hello, and welcome back to the Introduction to Philosophy course at the University of Edinburgh. My name is Matthew Chrisman. I'm a reader in philosophy here in the School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language Sciences. Today, I want to talk to you about a topic in moral philosophy that I call the status of morality. What is morality? Well, that's a really big question. Today, what we'll focus on is particular moral judgments and ask about their status. What do I mean by particular moral judgments? Well, I have in mind the everyday sort of judgments that we make when we think something like what Pol Pot did in the genocide was morally abhorrent, or giving to charity is a good thing to do. But also the kind of moral judgments that ethical philosophers make. They make judgments that are a little bit more abstract. They say things like, an action is right insofar as it maximizes overall happiness, or one ought to always act in a way that one could will one's reason to be reasons for everyone else. These are very abstract moral judgments made in ethical theory. We have the particular moral judgments made in everyday life. Today, we won't be asking whether these are correct, whether specific moral judgments or abstract moral judgments are correct or incorrect. Rather, we'll be asking about the status of these judgments. What are we doing when we make such judgments? Are we representing objective facts of the matter? Or are we describing our personal or cultural practices? Are we depicting some element of the universe out there, the moral facts? Or are we expressing our emotions towards things? These are the types of questions that we ask when we ask about the status of morality. So what I want to do today is delve into that question a little bit more, try to understand the nature of the question, what exactly are we asking when we ask about the status of morality, and then move on to three very general types of approaches that philosophers have taken to this question. So one of these approaches I'll call objectivism, the idea that we are representing objective facts when we make moral judgments. Another approach is relativism, the idea that we're describing some kind of cultural or personal relative practices when we make these judgments. And the third idea is emotivism, that we're expressing our emotions towards the world when we make these judgments. So those will be the three general types of theories we'll talk about today after I introduce the topic, and then we'll think a little bit about objections and replies to those theories. One more comment before we get into the issues. I'll be using examples of particular moral judgments as we go along, and I've chosen controversial examples on purpose. I want you to see through the controversy why it's important to think about the status of morality. So some of the examples will be controversial, and some of them you might disagree with. That's fine. Today's question is not whether these particular judgments are right or wrong, but what we're doing when we make these judgments. What is their status? So at a later point in the lecture, I'll ask you to come up with some examples of your own, and controversial examples are good. They help us to think about the status of morality. So today we're talking about the status of morality. The status of moral judgments. What are we doing when we judge that something's good or bad, right or wrong, virtuous or vicious? One way to get your heads around that question is to generate two lists and compare and contrast these lists. So what I want to do now is generate a list of empirical judgments, judgments about the empirically discoverable world, and a list of moral judgments, judgments about what's right and wrong, good and bad, etc. So one way to think about an empirical judgment is to think about something that was discovered, a scientific discovery. Here's a really famous scientific discovery. The Earth rotates around the sun. Of course, for much of human history, people didn't believe that. They thought that the sun rotated around the Earth, or they had some other cosmological theory, but Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo discovered that the Earth rotates around the sun and developed our contemporary cosmological theory, how we understand the orbits of the planets. The judgment, the Earth rotates around the sun, that's an empirical judgment. Or the judgment that electricity has positive and negative charges, discovered by Benjamin Franklin, explains the flow of electricity. That judgment is a judgment about the empirical world. Or consider Mendel's discovery that plants inherit some of their traits genetically based on certain laws of inheritance. That judgment, that plants inherit some of their traits genetically, is an empirical judgment about the empirical world. Or here's a final, more contemporary example. Recently it was discovered that the so-called God particle predicted by Edinburgh's own Professor Peter Higgs exist. That seems to be an empirical discovery about a fundamental piece of the universe. But in order to get empirical judgments on our list, we don't have to have these very impressive scientific discoveries. We can also just think of more everyday judgments, like the judgment that lead is heavier than iron, or the judgment, quite simply, that it was sunny today in Edinburgh, or even the judgment that I, Matthew Christman, am less than 6 feet tall. All of these are empirical judgments, judgments that we can verify by empirical observation. Okay, now for our second list, moral judgments. To generate some examples of moral judgments, we could think about positive moral things like giving to charity is good, or taking care of your children is morally obligatory. These are examples of positive moral judgments. We could add to that list something like protesting something you take to be a gross injustice is morally right. That would be a moral judgment. Of course, more often, actually, I think we make negative moral judgments. So we say things like, Cain's killing Abel out of jealousy was morally bad, was wrong. Or Oedipus' sleeping with his mother Jocasta was morally bad. That would be a moral judgment. Or something like Pol Pot's genocidal actions during the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia was morally abhorrent. Genocide's morally abhorrent. Those would be moral judgments. Or finally, a much more controversial one, polygamy, the practice of one man having multiple wives or one woman having multiple husbands, is morally dubious. These are the types of judgments that we could put on our list as moral judgments. Okay, so we've come up with two lists, a list of empirical judgments and a list of moral judgments. Some of the items on my list are quite controversial. So what I want you to do now is try to come up with some examples of your own. They can be controversial examples or examples that you take to be obvious, but come up with two examples of each type, two examples of empirical judgments about the empirically discoverable world, and examples of moral judgments about things like what's right and wrong, good and bad, virtuous, vicious, etc. We'll take a second here and let you come up with these examples. It'd be helpful to write them down on a piece of paper so that you can refer to them in the rest of this lecture. Okay, hopefully you have your own examples. Two examples of empirical judgments and two examples of moral judgments. Or if you want some more time or time to think about it, you can push pause on the video now. For the rest of the lecture, I'm going to focus on examples from my list, two examples of empirical judgments and two examples of moral judgments. So here are the two examples of empirical judgments I'll use. The sun rotates around the earth, and it was sunny in Edinburgh today. And here are two examples of moral judgments that I'll use. Genocide is morally wrong or morally abhorrent, and polygamy is morally dubious. So we'll focus on those as examples of moral judgments. But you can also think about your own examples and ask the same sorts of questions we're going to ask about these, about your examples. So now, what we've been doing is coming up with these examples in order to better understand the question about the status of morality. I think the best way into that is to now ask some questions about these two lists. So many philosophers, and I think many ordinary people, have felt that there's an important difference between the types of judgments that go under the heading empirical judgments and the types of judgments that go under the heading moral judgments. They feel like there's something importantly different between these two things. So one thing we could ask, the first question I'll ask is, are these judgments the sorts of things that can be true or false? So in the case of empirical judgments, it's quite natural to say yes, of course. Whereas some philosophers have thought, in the case of moral judgment, that they're not the sort of thing that can be true or false. They're mere opinions or mere expressions of our emotions. Now, other philosophers and other people have thought, no, that's not right. There's still a difference, but that's not the difference. So we ask a second question. If moral judgments are like empirical judgments, in that they can be true or false, what makes them true or false? In the empirical case, you might think it's something about the objective, human, independent facts. What is it in the moral case? And now we can ask a third question. Are they objectively true or false? So you might think the difference between these two lists is no, they're not objectively true or false. moral judgments are not objectively true or false. They're only true or false relative to a culture or a person or a sensibility or something like that. Now that's the kind of second group of philosophers that I'll talk about. The third group of philosophers that I'll talk about deny both of these initial ideas and say moral judgments are the sorts of things that can be true or false. And they're also the sorts of things that can be made true or false by objective facts. They're objectively true or false. They aspire to objectivity just like empirical judgments. So what I want to do in the rest of this lecture is talk about these three philosophical approaches to the status of morality. We'll talk about the objectivist idea that moral judgments are just as objective as empirical judgments. And then we'll talk about the relativist idea that moral judgments are importantly different than empirical judgments in that they're relativized somehow. And finally, we'll talk about the emotivist idea that moral judgments aren't the sorts of things that can be true or false. They are mere opinions or expressions of our emotions. We'll explore some of the advantages and disadvantages of each of these theories and consider some of the objections that proponents of one or another theory levy against the other theories. That's the plan for the rest of the lecture.